If you've ever wondered what the arcade classic Rampage would be like if you had to play as a puny human rather than one of the skyscraper-smashing Goliaths, then Kong Survivor Instinct might be your answer. This 2.5D Metroidvania platformer takes place amidst a crumbling coastal cityscape, while Kong and his kaiju combatants duke it out in the background, making it seem at first glance a bit like a shadow complex situated within the shadow of the Colossus. It's a novel enough concept, but basic environmental puzzle design and uninspired combat mean that Survivor Instinct is unable to reach the towering heights of its ideas. And as I begrudgingly pushed crates and collected keys to make my way through each ruined urban rabbit hole, I could never really shake the impression that Kong seemed to be having considerably more fun than I was. Not that actually playing as Kong would be a guaranteed good time, of course. 2023's Skull Island Rise of Kong was such an unmitigated disaster that the aftermath of its self-destruction is probably still being studied by scientists from the Monarch organization. Kong Survivor Instinct is a notably better game than that, but once the novelty of having the iconic angry ape messing about in the middle distance fades, it just doesn't have the level of creativity or player freedom that other superior games of this ilk released in recent years, such as Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown or Blasphemous 2, have so expertly displayed. It also doesn't have much of a story beyond "don't get smashed by the monkey." We play as David Martin, a single dad in search of his daughter who's gone missing in the midst of the spectacular city-ravaging Royal Rumble that's currently sweeping along the west coast of the United States.
According to our sources, one of the attacking titans is Kong.
The elevator pitch of David's personality is basically a sort of middle-aged Nathan Drake who's apparently forgotten how to be funny.
That spider was huge! Where the heck did it come from? Skull Island?
And the handful of survivors he meets along the way don't even pretend to be real characters.
A Monarch search and rescue. We don't evacuate.
There are a couple of appearances from the villainous Alan Jonah, who was last seen in 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters. There he was played by a typically cold and ruthless Charles Dance, also known as Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones.
We'll take it.
But here he's voiced by a somewhat subdued sound-alike.
So what are you waiting for?
None of these details really matter though, since Kong Survivor Instinct's slight amount of story is stretched thin over its 6-hour frame, until it suddenly snaps apart during its jarringly abrupt and underwhelming conclusion.
You did this, huh? You brought these monsters upon us?
The story may be weak, but the look and feel of its crumbling 2.5D environments is undoubtedly its strength. David's quest leads him from smouldering suburban outskirts to devastated downtown areas and the mysterious subterranean facilities below. And each dilapidated diorama is rich with precise detail and convincing depth. Kong Survivor Instinct does perhaps try a bit too hard to convince you that every structure you explore is an unstable one, with the repetitive routine with which it collapses the floor beneath your feet or drops chunks of the ceiling onto your skull, and that does get old pretty fast. However, it also allows you to scamper along the roofs of cars suspended by the webs of a towering arachnid, and navigate your way through the slanted corridors of an apartment building that's been violently upended by Kong, so there are some more interesting platforming sections among them. It's just a shame that so much of the exploration is built around the same pushing of crates and shooting of padlocked gates. The very best Metroidvanias, like Hollow Knight or Metroid Dread, gradually empower you with new tools and abilities that incentivize you to backtrack through the world and unlock previously unreachable areas. But Kong Survivor Instinct is comparatively light on when it comes to evolving the ways in which you interact with your surroundings. Here, by contrast, David is given a sledgehammer to smash through weakened walls, and eventually a grappling hook to scale up to specific anchor points. But otherwise his progression is always painfully obvious and consists of the same rehashed circuit boxes to shoot or generators to repair, copied and pasted along the winding path towards each mission objective. This general absence of ingenuity also drains the enjoyment out of its combat, which is primarily geared towards melee attacks since ammunition for David's pistol is so scarce. There is some nuance to each scrap with Jonah's soldiers. You can block or parry their blows to open them up for a counter-attack, or grab them to use as a human shield when their more heavily armed comrades open fire. And I was pleased to discover that you can even shoot them in the leg to drop them to their knees so that you can deliver a series of finishing blows a la Resident Evil 4.
Jonas said he'd be dropping by.
At the same time, there's a stiffness to each scrap, particularly when David finds himself surrounded, and since he's unable to jump or climb when he's locked in a combat stance, there were times when I'd knock an enemy off a ledge only to find myself unable to drop down and continue the fight. The only way forward was to reload my save and try again. Furthermore, rather than introduce any interesting new enemy types that require you to adapt your methods of attack, Kong Survivor Instinct just gradually ups the number of foes in each encounter, while keeping your combat abilities exactly the same. David's pistol can be upgraded to carry more rounds per magazine to help counter the swelling hordes, but there are no other firearms to find despite the fact that every other goon you come across in the story's second half seems to be toting a pump-action shotgun.
That's enough violence for a lifetime.
When you consider that outside of the human soldier types there are only a couple of small spider-like enemies to contend with, and absolutely no boss fights whatsoever, Kong Survivor Instinct's combat feels flatter than a Kaiju's couch cushion overall.
It can't get much worse than this, right? No, not this thing again!
While there might not be any traditional boss fights, Kong Survivor Instinct does feature a handful of sequences that could be best described as boss flights. At specific points during the story, Kong or one of his rival titans will spot you through the window of a structure, and you'll be suddenly forced to flee, with the monster punching wrecking ball-sized holes in your path that require some pinpoint platforming to evade. These sections certainly inject a burst of excitement and urgency into the adventure, although they also involve a fair amount of trial and error to get around instant deaths, which did lead to some frustrating repeated checkpoint restarts at times. Still, watching one of these monolithic beasts unwrap the building you're trapped inside of like a kaiju kid on Christmas morning is undoubtedly one of the most spectacular tricks that Kong Survivor Instinct has up its sleeves.
Damn, that was close.
Unfortunately, those are the only times that Kong and company have a measurable impact on the action. Elsewhere, these Goliaths are only ever glimpsed, either having an incidental tussle in the distant background, or when you summon one by collecting the requisite number of biowaves scattered around each level to clear a block path towards a level's exit in a game of supersized Simeon Simon Says.
What if someone could clear the path for me? Like, say, a monster as tall as a skyscraper.
It's certainly a treat to watch Kong casually pick up a connected row of train carriages like they're steel sausage links and violently wrench them apart. But the operative word here is watch. Once these path-clearing actions have been performed, it's straight back to the same plodding puzzle platforming and uninspired combat.
I just want it to end.
Setting a Metroidvania-style platforming adventure against a backdrop of building-razing beasts is certainly an intriguing idea, but unlike its towering cast of Kaiju cameos, Kong Survivor Instinct itself simply doesn't measure up. Its story and characters are underwritten, its ravaged urban playground is eye-catching but not particularly surprising to explore, and its combat fails to evolve enough to keep the fights interesting over the course of the journey.
You could have left me alone.
The occasional room-rocking escape sequences do literally shake things up, but they're few and far between and only distract from the otherwise uncomplicated platforming for short bursts at a time. Kong and his kind may hail from an alternate world hidden deep inside the Earth's core, but the actual gameplay of Kong Survivor Instinct is strictly one-dimensional. For more IGN reviews, check out our verdicts on Super Mario Party Jamboree and MechWarrior 5 Clans, and for everything else, stick with IGN.
Damn. I hope there was no one inside.